Hello everyone, welcome back. So last time we had add the component for my account where we can have the login new account, get a password, things like this laid out. And then in this lesson we'll start to work on the backend part. For each of this functionality, login, new account, get a password, and let's go ahead and do that. So first of all, for login part, it's similar to our admin portal, right? For the backend, as we have already developed the functionality if you log in for admin portal, it should work similarly for the front end part as well, because we have the login resource available so that the user can visit the token endpoint and trade for the the token, and every time we can do a check session to check whether the session is active or not, and we have the user logout endpoint for logging the user out. Okay, so let's just try to log in as previously using the same username and password. Okay, incorrect username or password. Looks like we are having some problem. Let's see. Request header field authorize. Looks like there's some spelling error. Authorization. Okay, let's come back and take a look. That should be in the, let's see, login service, and here we have authorization. Okay. Let's try it again. So after we log in, it refreshes, the page refreshes, right? And we can go take a look at our network to see if there is any transaction, well, since the page has been refreshed, we don't know whether we have login or not. But we can come to, let's for example, come to my account. Now we have the check session running, right? And this gives us a successful response. Session active, that means we have already logged in. But the thing is, after we log in, we shouldn't see this my account link anymore. Instead, we should see something else, as we have defined in navigation bar, the HTML. So we have a list of elements to be displayed. We have my account, shopping cart, my profile, and logout. So this my account will be displayed if the user hasn't logged in. Once the user has logged in, shopping cart, my profile, logout should be displayed. Okay, so looks like that part is not implemented yet. So, and further notice would be showing that we have the variable defined here with admin if, right? That looks correct, and we should have this logged in variable defined in the component. Looks like not, so let's just go ahead and do that. For private login, because defaults by default, and let's see, that should be enough for now. And we're gonna need the login service. From services, login the service. Okay, and we need to initialize that. Private login services, login service, and then whenever we initialize this component, we're gonna check session subscribe res and error. Okay, let's come back and take a look. So there we go. So after we log in, we have the shopping cart My Profile logout displayed. And if we click on logout, well, nothing happened because we haven't linked it yet. Link the logout function, I mean. So let's add that method here. Suppose we have a logout method. It will in turn call login service that logout method subscribe. And we have the location that reload. Or we can just simply log the error. Okay. Let's come back and take a look. Logout. Hold on. We have to log out. When we click on logout, it calls the logout method, so that's correct. And if we click on logout, the My account displayed. And once we log in, okay, so that looks good. So the login part looks good. We just need to take care of the user and forget password then. And for user resources, we're gonna need to define a new file. So here we're gonna right click on the resource, create a new class called user resource. Add REST controller, add request mapping / user. And within its body, we're going to define a request mapping value equals to new user. Sorry, it should be / new user. And mapper equals to request mapper.post. This post method. And we're gonna have the response as response entity, new user, host, and here we'll have HTTP servlet request and add request body. We're gonna map it to a hash map where we have string type as key and string type as value. And I'm gonna call it mapper. This will throw exception. Okay. And just shift O to import all the packages. So first we're gonna get a username as string from mapper.get username. Okay. Secondly, we'll have the user email from mapper as well, and this will be from email. If user service dot find by username not equals to now, that means the user already exists. We're going to return new response entity with the value of username exists. HTTP status dot bad request. And we're gonna copy this again. So we're gonna do a find by email. Here we have user email. Email exists. Okay. So we don't have the user service defined yet. Let's first try to auto-write it. So let's go to user service. We need to add two or say multiple new method. The first one is find by username. So this will take a string username. And the second one will be find by email. This one would take a string of email. And then we'll have a couple more. One save. Basically this will save the user and find by ID. So this will take an ID and return the user. Okay. So let's see. We're going to define that into our user service implementation. Okay. Public user save user. We're gonna return user repository dot save user. Okay, that's easy, and it's a good habit actually to add override when you override a method. Okay, so that's for easy reading the code. And then we have the find by ID, which take the ID as parameter and return the user repository dot find one ID. And now we're gonna have another one. Find by username, which takes a username string. Return user repository dot find by username, and this will take the username as input. And after that, we are gonna have another one, find by email. So this will take the string email and return the user repository dot find by email. Okay, so that's our user service. So we haven't finished this user post method yet, but let's just pause for the video for now. We're gonna continue in the next lesson. Alright? See you guys in the next video. Bye.